You wake up and the first thing you do, before coffee, before your phone, before you're even fully conscious, is walk to the mirror and deal with your hair. Maybe you brush it, maybe you wet it down. Maybe you spend 20 minutes fighting frizz with 3 different products that promise to make it behave. It feels like such a small, mundane decision, but that 5 minutes in front of the mirror is actually a 5-minute encounter with about 200,000 years of human migration, climate adaptation, and evolutionary survival strategy, written directly into the shape of the follicles on your scalp. Because here's the thing, nobody really stops to ask, why does hair look so completely different across human populations? Why is some hair tightly coiled and springy, some loosely wavy, some poker straight and heavy? It's not random. It's not just genetics in some vague, hand-wavy sense. Every hair type on every human head today is the end result of a specific ancient environmental problem being solved by evolution, generation after generation, in wildly different corners of the planet. So the question is simple. With one single ancestral population in Africa, roughly 200,000 years ago, how did humanity end up with this much variation? How did one species split into people with hair that ranges from tight coils to straight sheets, all from the same genetic starting point? Let's start with the part almost nobody explains properly, which is what hair texture actually is on a physical level. Hair texture isn't determined by the hair itself. It's determined by the shape of the follicle, the tiny tube in your skin the hair grows out of. A round, symmetrical follicle produces straight hair because the strand extrudes evenly in every direction. Like toothpaste coming out of a perfectly circular tube, an oval or asymmetrical follicle produces wavy or curly hair because the strand is being pushed out unevenly, forcing it to bend as it grows. And a flattened, ribbon-shaped follicle, curved like a tiny comma beneath the skin, produces the tightest coils, the kind of hair that can shrink to a fraction of its stretched-out length. This isn't cosmetic trivia. This is architecture, quite literally shaped by evolution over hundreds of thousands of years to solve a problem your ancestors were dealing with every single day, whether they knew it or not. And that problem, for the very first modern humans, was heat. Specifically, the brutal, relentless heat of equatorial Africa, where Homo sapiens first appeared. Here's what doesn't make sense until you think about it properly. You'd assume more hair, thicker hair, would be worse in extreme heat. But tightly coiled hair does something genuinely brilliant. Researchers, including biological anthropologist Nina Jablonski of Penn State, have studied how tightly coiled hair creates a kind of natural, built-in air gap between the scalp and the outside world, insulating the skull from direct solar radiation while still allowing heat and sweat to escape. In experimental studies comparing scalp temperatures under different hair types exposed to simulated intense sun, tightly curled hair reduced the amount of solar heat actually reaching the scalp by a meaningful margin compared to straight hair, essentially acting as a natural shade structure sitting directly on top of your skull. Your brain, sitting just beneath that scalp, is one of the most heat-sensitive organs in your entire body. Overheat it and you're in genuine danger. Fast. So in the specific environment where humans first evolved, tightly coiled hair wasn't a cosmetic feature. It was a life support system for your brain. Now here's where it gets interesting. Because humans didn't stay in equatorial Africa. Starting somewhere around 70,000 years ago, waves of modern humans began migrating outward, into environments that had absolutely nothing in common with the world their hair had evolved for. And this is the part that reframes the whole story. As populations moved into cooler, less sun-intense regions, that same tightly coiled, heat-shedding hair became less advantageous because the problem it had been solving simply wasn't the dominant problem anymore. In colder, lower UV environments like Northern Europe and Northeast Asia, hair began trending straighter and in many populations, finer. Over thousands of generations, straighter hair lies flatter against the head and along the neck, providing a bit more direct insulation coverage against cold air, while also allowing natural oils, sebum, to travel more efficiently down the length of the strand, which some researchers suggest may have offered additional weatherproofing in harsh, wet, cold climates. It's not that curly hair suddenly became a disadvantage everywhere. It's that different environments were quietly running different evolutionary experiments on the exact same starting material, and hair follicles responded. Here's a fact that genuinely surprises most people the first time they hear it. One of the clearest, most specific genetic fingerprints of this whole process comes from a single gene called EDAR. In 2008, a team led by geneticist Yana Kamberov, working with researchers including Pardis Sabeti, traced a particular variant of the EDAR gene that appears to have arisen in central China roughly 30,000 years ago and then spread rapidly through East Asian populations. This one genetic variant is directly linked to thicker hair shafts, and it didn't spread because ancient humans in the region were consciously selecting for it. It appears to have hitchhiked along with other traits the gene also influences, including sweat gland density, that provided a genuine survival advantage in that specific environment. Think about that for a second. A single mutation arising in one region, in one small population, roughly 30,000 years ago, is a meaningful part of the reason hair texture patterns look the way they do across East Asia today. That's not ancient history in some abstract sense. That's a gene you can still isolate and study in a lab right now, sitting quietly in billions of human genomes. But heat and cold aren't the only forces at work here. And this is where the story gets a little more uncomfortable, because hair texture didn't just evolve, it got weaponized. Once European colonization began spreading across Africa, the Americas, and beyond starting in the 15th and 16th centuries, hair texture stopped being understood as elegant environmental adaptation and started being twisted into a tool of racial hierarchy. Tightly coiled hair, the exact same trait that had been quietly protecting equatorial human brains from solar radiation for hundreds of thousands of years, was recast by colonial systems as something to be ashamed of, something unprofessional, something requiring chemical straightening or forced cutting to be considered acceptable. In the United States specifically, formal legal protections against hair-based discrimination, laws like the Crown Act, only began appearing state by state starting in 2019. Read that again. It took until 2019 for American law to formally start catching up to what evolutionary biology had understood for over a century. That this variation isn't a flaw or a deviation from some normal hair type. It's simply one branch of the same evolutionary tree, dealing with a completely different set of environmental pressures. There's another layer to this that almost never comes up, and it involves Neanderthals. Hair grooming itself. The physical act of one person touching and caring for another person's hair has been observed as a bonding behavior in primates for decades, and there's compelling reason to believe this behavior runs just as deep in humans, wired into us long before anyone had a word for hairstyle. So even as your ancestors' hair was being shaped by sun exposure and temperature and continental migration, it was simultaneously becoming a canvas for identity, status, and love, completely independent of the environment that originally created it. So here's what nobody really puts together when they're standing in front of a mirror complaining about frizz or flatness or whatever their hair happens to be doing that morning. Every strand on your head is carrying an actual historical record. It's telling you, in follicle shape and shaft thickness and curl pattern, roughly where your ancestors lived, roughly how intense the sun was where they stood, roughly how cold the winters got, and in some cases, which now extinct human species they occasionally had children with, there is no default human hair type sitting somewhere out there as the correct baseline that everything else deviates from. There was only a single ancestral population in Africa roughly 200,000 years ago, and a few thousand generations of that population spreading into wildly different environments. And evolution quietly, patiently, running its own regional experiments in every single one of them. So let's pull all of that back together. Your ancestors' hair had to solve heat in equatorial Africa, and it answered with tight coils that shaded the scalp. It had to solve cold and low sunlight further north, and it answered with straighter, flatter strands that hugged the head. It had one specific mutation appear in central China roughly 30,000 years ago, and an entire regional hair pattern shifted in response. It even borrowed, in some populations, a genetic head start from an entirely different species of human that no longer exists. 4 completely different environmental pressures, 4 completely different evolutionary answers, all written onto the exact same basic biological template. Zoom out far enough, and hair texture stops looking like a source of division and starts looking like something closer to a map, not a hierarchy. A map, a physical, wearable record of the specific corner of Earth your ancestors adapted to survive, whether that was the equator or the Arctic Circle or somewhere in between. The fact that human hair looks this different across the species isn't evidence that we're fundamentally different from each other. It's evidence of exactly the opposite. It's proof of just how relentlessly adaptable one single human lineage turned out to be, spreading across nearly every climate on the planet, and every single time finding a way to make it work. So tonight, when you're standing in front of that mirror, again, brushing it, wetting it down, fighting with it, or just running your fingers through it without thinking, remember what you're actually looking at. You're not looking at a flaw to be fixed or a standard to be matched. You're looking at 200,000 years of migration, heat, cold, borrowed Neanderthal genes, and pure evolutionary problem solving, sitting quietly on top of your head, waiting for you to notice it was there the whole time.